Hello there, I'm That Other George, and nostalgia in media is an incredibly powerful tool that is utilised to invoke a strong emotional response from the audience. This will usually result in a higher box office gross, and will typically receive more praise, which is often not an accurate reflection of the quality within the piece of media, but rather the novelty that comes with it. And these big studios are taking full advantage of this. Just look at the response to the fairly recent trailer for The Flash. You would imagine that for a movie titled The Flash, the conversation would be surrounding The Flash. But since Michael Keaton's Batman was shown in the trailer, the nostalgia overpowered all the other elements, and therefore dominated the discussion for that movie. When it comes to pieces of media taking advantage of nostalgia, there is unfortunately not a very good track record. What could be a very meaningful appearance are often hollow or forced cameos that can take away from the original content. However, that's not to say that nostalgia in media is always a bad thing. Take my favourite TV show, Better Call Saul, for example. It's of course a prequel to the other incredible show, Breaking Bad. And it was fairly obvious that towards the end of the show, Walter and Jesse would have their cameo appearances. But rather than rushing straight to these cameos in one of the earlier seasons, the show instead tells its own story for seasons 1 to 5 and the vast majority of 6. The brilliant thing about Better Call Saul is despite mostly being a prequel, the series does jump ahead to show how Saul is getting on post Breaking Bad. It's presenting us with two different timelines with all the events of Breaking Bad in the middle. It therefore follows that at some point the show is going to catch up with the latter timeline. So why not take full and creative advantage of this by showing some different points of view from iconic moments in Breaking Bad? The Walter and Jesse cameos are fantastic because they're important to the current story being told, by showing the reflection in events and how Saul is making all the same mistakes that he was back then. At the same time, these cameos are not being presented as anything more than they need to be. They are very simple and to the point, acknowledging and paying respect to the previous show, without undermining or changing anything that show accomplished. And it's a shame that more studios won't take notes from this. And what I believe to be the worst studio when it comes to this is Disney. Particularly with how they've handled the Star Wars franchise. Ever since the Force Awakens trailer, they have been trying to shove in as much Star Wars memorabilia as possible. And in this case, a lot of the references ended up being quite nonsensical in the finished film. Like Kylo worshipping Darth Vader. The reason why Darth Vader's helmet is in his possession is for Kylo to aspire to be just like him. But the motivation for this outside of the movie is simply for the viewers to see a cool Star Wars reference. And more importantly to have it in the trailer among other cool things to ensure the film makes $2 billion. The main issue, however, is the story is very much at odds with this. It's absurd to assume that Kylo would have no knowledge of his grandfather's redemption, so therefore there would be zero reason for him to follow in his footsteps. Many ideas these movies have simply do not line up with what came before, and even when there is a spark of hope, it's always let down. The Star Wars story films were released in between the sequels. They also contain many elements of hollow nostalgia. However, nothing will compare to the recent Star Wars TV shows. With the exception of Andor. There was actually a story in that one. The Mandalorian released in 2019, and at the time it felt like exactly what Star Wars needed. A small-scale series that follows a bounty hunter travelling across the galaxy and making some cash. That's sort of what it started out as, but it almost seemed like the show was required to still contain Star Wars memorabilia. And by season 2, it was clear the show was focusing less on its own story, and focusing a lot more on featuring previously established characters. It's crazy to think how the Star Wars universe seems so vast, and yet we start following this new character and he spends all his time on planets we've already seen before, and he manages to bump into the most important characters in all of Star Wars. I believe this franchise has the potential to tell some really interesting stories in parts of the galaxy that are not fully connected with the mainline story. Unfortunately, from a business perspective, it's a much safer option to stick with what people associate with the brand. And the final episode in Season 2 of The Mandalorian is certainly proof of that. The Dark Troopers were the looming threat in the second season, and they seem incredibly powerful. But apparently, they are just as stupid as stormtroopers. So whilst on Gus Fring's ship, Mando is battling one of the Dark Troopers, and despite a lot of struggle, he manages to defeat him with a spear, and the others are about to break down a sealed door and get to him as well. But he simply pulls a lever and they go into the vacuum of space. Okay. Mando then proceeds to fight and capture Gus Fring. Keep in mind that at this point in the episode, around 7 whole minutes of screen time has passed since Mando pulled that lever. And that is screen time. There would be no way to estimate it, but it's safe to assume that more than 7 minutes passed in-universe before the Dark Troopers fly back on board the ship. So I guess they were just floating about in space for a while? Very bizarre, but okay. I guess our heroes are in trouble now. But thankfully an X-Wing shows up, and a mysterious cloaked figure with a green lightsaber chops down all the Dark Troopers with ease. What seemed like a huge threat in the season have become nothing more than battle droids. It is incredibly underwhelming, and somehow I believe that Mando pulling that lever is more narratively satisfying. So the completely mysterious person turns out to be Luke Skywalker. He's come to pick up Grogu and show him the ways of the Force. And this, person is nothing like Luke. He doesn't ask any questions about who any of these people are. He's not trying to figure out what's gone down on this ship. He just takes Grogu and leaves. Not only is this so hollow and absolutely nothing like the Luke I know, this decision even gets Una reversed later down the line, making Luke's whole appearance in this show unbelievably pointless. And that's the end of Season 2, but there's a Marvel-style post-credit scene that sets up the Book of Boba Fett. The first 4 episodes of this show are about Boba Fett escaping the Sarlacc pit, joining, Tusken Raiders, and for some reason wanted to become the Crime Lord in Tatooine. They were rather bizarre episodes that were not very well received, but it won the audience back by episode 5, when the show essentially became Mandalorian Season 2.5. He was back to bounty hunting. We almost saw more of that in this one random episode of Boba Fett than we did in his own show. Most of this episode I would say is fairly solid. However, as we near the end, Mando goes to the mechanic he knows on Tatooine, as he is in need of a new ship. Now his previous ship, the Razor Crest, was perfect for him. He used the ship as a way to store his weapons and gear, and also the bounties that he throws in carbonite. A perfectly appropriate ship for his needs. But in recent years these shows have fully embraced the prequels. Say what you want about those movies, but the world building was excellent, and felt very expansive by introducing so many cool concepts into the Star Wars universe. But of course, now even the prequels are being exploited for their nostalgia. So the mechanic ends up convincing Mando that he should have the Naboo N1 starfighter. In universe, this is a ridiculous decision. There's little room for him to store his weapons and gear, and there's absolutely no room for him to store his frozen bounties. But out of universe, this decision is made for the fans to have a positive experience with seeing good memorabilia from The Phantom Menace. But the exploitation of nostalgia in this episode comes nowhere close to episode 6, which goes from a Mandalorian episode to an everything ever in Star Wars episode. We see Luke training with Grogu, and later on Luke gives a baby the choice of continuing to train with him or go back to Mando, and Luke just sends him away in the next episode, of course making the finale of The Mandalorian Season 2 utterly pointless. And speaking of utterly pointless, towards the end of this episode, we see a figure in the distance walking towards Timothy Olyphant. I feel the need to point out that this individual is not just walking out from a desert, but rather a whole desert planet. Could he not be on a speeder at the very least? Whatever.
Whatever Fett is paying you, we'll match. And all you've got to do is stay put and let things play out. I'd be careful where I was sticking my nose if I were you.
He doesn't have a nose! How do you write this? But of course, people reacted incredibly positively to this because of the nostalgia of Cad Bane in the Clone Wars series. So he kills Timothy Olyphant, only for now, because no one's ever really gone, and he's going to be the big baddie of the next episode. Which is also the final episode of the season.
Don't toy with me. I'm not a little boy any longer, and you are an old man.
I'm still faster than you.
That may be, but I have armor.
Well, I brought my dinosaur! Who eats force field dogs?
Usually, the brilliant thing about TV shows is that you can give opposing characters enough time to develop and build up their rivalry for each other, so that when that season finale payoff hits, it feels incredibly satisfying. Nothing here was achieved. The only way that anyone can get anything from this is with their knowledge of Cad Bane from the Clone Wars. This rivalry was established at the end of one episode and paid off in the very next. No amount of nostalgia will cover up how underwhelming this finale really is. Despite stealing the spotlight from Boba Fett, it was obvious that Mando was going to get another season. Now, The Mandalorian has always been known for its filler episodes, but Season 3 felt like a whole season of filler episodes. We of course saw plenty of Star Wars memorabilia and a couple very awkward celebrity cameos, but unlike Season 2, there weren't any iconic characters that returned to generate some audience hype. And as a result, there was significantly less interest from viewers, with not many online discussions taking place. Guess they should have forced in a Han Solo appearance. And I find this to be a fitting way to end this video. Including nostalgia in your story may garner plenty of audience interest short term, but long term, people will notice the lack of creativity on display. And if this nostalgia is being incorporated into a series, then you're eventually going to have to move on and tell your own story. A show like Better Call Saul contains an excellent, unique story, with appropriate and well-earned moments of nostalgia. A show like The Mandalorian contains a very hollow and unoriginal story. The earlier seasons simply had enough distractions to hide this, and when it was time to move on with its own narrative, it was incredibly underwhelming, proving that unfortunately many pieces of media like this prioritize nostalgia over substance. The good news, however, is that plenty of great media comes out each and every year, and even the media about already established IPs can often do a very good job of telling their own story. So instead of feeling let down by all these dead franchises, we need to celebrate when the studios get it right. I've been your host, That Other George, and thank you for watching.